We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.
The Soviet-Afghan War was a protracted period of conflict between 1979 and 1989 that began with the Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan. It was a major event that affected both regional and global political balances, and its consequences left deep scars in the Middle East and Central Asia. Here is a closer look at the details of the Soviet-Afghan War. Origins and causes. The Soviet-Afghan War began in 1979 with the Soviet Union's military intervention in Afghanistan. The Soviets sent military forces into Afghanistan to support the communist regime and increase their influence in the region. The ruling People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan had come to power with the support of the Soviets. However, this regime was often at odds with the opposition, and instability in the country increased. The Soviets intervened directly to protect the regime and increase their influence in the region. Development of the conflict. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan was largely guerrilla warfare. Afghan resistance fighters formed various groups to fight the Soviet occupation. The most important of these groups were the Mujahideen and the Taliban. The Soviet army tried various strategies to establish control in Afghanistan, but the resistance they faced was very strong. The international dimension. The Soviet-Afghan War caused a great deal of international concern. The US and other Western countries condemned the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and supported the Afghan insurgents. The US took various economic and military measures against the Soviet presence in Afghanistan and provided arms and training to the insurgents. As this period also coincided with the end of the Cold War, the Soviet failure in Afghanistan further diminished the already weakened power of the Soviet Union. Conclusions. The Soviet presence in Afghanistan resulted in years of war and heavy human losses. In 1989, Soviet leaders decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, officially ending the Soviet-Afghan War. However, the end of the war did not bring stability and peace to Afghanistan. Conflicts between the Mujahideen, the rise of the Taliban, and the subsequent intervention of the United States against the Taliban regime in 2001 ensured the continuation of conflict in the region. The Soviet-Afghan War was a major event that affected regional and global political balances. It had profound and long-lasting consequences for both the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. With the end of the war, the search for stability and peace in Afghanistan continues, but further efforts are needed to end conflict and instability in the region. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The Soviet intervention in Afghanistan began on 24 December 1979. It was aimed at supporting the communist regime and increasing Soviet influence in Afghanistan. This intervention was met with great anger by the Western powers, and as it took place at the height of the Cold War, increased tensions between East and West. Resistance and guerrilla warfare. The Soviet occupation sparked resistance among much of the Afghan population. Various resistance groups formed against the Soviets. There were both ethnic and ideological differences between these groups. The resistance also received support from the civilian population and targeted those who collaborated with the Soviets. This meant that the conflict took on the character of guerrilla warfare. The Soviets tried to suppress this resistance, often using heavy artillery and airstrikes, but the results were not what they wanted. Soviet casualties and impact. The Soviet-Afghan War resulted in heavy losses for the Soviets. Soviet losses in Afghanistan were not officially reported, but estimates range from 15,000 to 50,000 soldiers killed and many more wounded. The Soviet Union's reputation was also severely damaged. The intervention was widely resented by the Soviet people and was seen as one of the factors contributing to the collapse of the Soviet Union. International repercussions. The Soviet-Afghan War had a major international impact. The US and its NATO allies provided logistical and military support to the Afghan insurgents. The US was known to have supplied weapons and training to the Afghan insurgents through Pakistan. This turned Afghanistan into a front in the Cold War and fueled ethnic and religious tensions in the region. The result, the war officially ended with the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. But this did not mean that Afghanistan had stabilized. Fighting between insurgent groups continued, and the late 1990s saw further turmoil with the rise of the Taliban. The consequences of the Soviet-Afghan War are still being felt in terms of Afghanistan's instability, the regional balance of power, and international relations. The Soviet-Afghan War is an important historical event with a global impact, not limited to one region. It left deep traces in the history of both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union and changed the course of world politics. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. The Soviet-Afghan War began in 1979 with the Soviet Union's military intervention in Afghanistan. The Soviets moved to support the communist regime in Afghanistan and increase their influence in the region. However, it should be noted that the communist regime in Afghanistan faced serious opposition from various ethnic and religious groups, and the country was plagued by internal instability. The Soviet intervention exacerbated these internal conflicts and increased the scale of the conflict. Resistance and guerrilla warfare. The Afghan people responded to the Soviet invasion by forming various resistance groups. These groups used guerrilla tactics to fight the Soviet troops. The Afghan resistance fought with flexibility and surprise tactics against the Soviets' heavy weapons and technological superiority. This guerrilla warfare made it difficult for the Soviets to maintain control in Afghanistan and eventually weakened the morale and confidence of Soviet troops. International dimension and support. The Soviet-Afghan War had far-reaching international implications. The US and other Western powers provided logistical, financial, and military support to the Afghan insurgents. This support made Afghanistan an important front in the Cold War. In particular, the US provided arms and training to the Afghan insurgents through Pakistan, which played a major role in the protracted conflict. Soviet losses and aftermath. The Soviet-Afghan War resulted in heavy losses for the Soviets. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed and thousands more wounded. These losses were widely resented by the Soviet people and were seen as one of the factors contributing to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The war officially ended in 1989 with the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. However, this withdrawal did not stabilize Afghanistan, and the country was plagued by civil wars and conflicts for many years. Conclusion and legacy. The Soviet-Afghan War had a profound and long-term impact on Afghanistan and the regional political balance. Since the end of the war, the search for stability and peace in Afghanistan has continued. However, developments such as the rise of the Taliban and the subsequent US intervention against the Taliban regime in 2001 have ensured continued conflict in the region. The Soviet-Afghan War will remain an important turning point in history. Both the Soviet Union and Afghanistan carried the scars of the war for many years, and the consequences of this event continue to shape the political and military dynamics in the Middle East and Central Asia. Soviet involvement. In 1979, the Soviet Union intervened militarily in support of the communist regime in Afghanistan. This intervention was motivated by the Soviet desire to establish control in Afghanistan and increase its influence in the region. The Soviets sent troops to Afghanistan to support the ruling People's Democratic Party regime. However, the Soviet military presence was met with great resistance and opposition from the Afghan people. Afghan resistance. The Afghan resistance to the Soviet occupation included various ethnic and religious groups. These groups rejected the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and its support for the communist regime and launched an armed struggle. The resistance fighters, also known as Mujahideen, often gathered in rural areas and fought the Soviet forces using guerrilla tactics. The Mujahideen included different ethnic groups and ideologies, but all were united in a common cause against the Soviet occupation. International support. The Soviet-Afghan War received widespread international support and opposition. Western countries, particularly the United States, which opposed the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, provided logistical, financial and military support to the Afghan insurgents. This included the provision of weapons, training and logistical support to the Afghan insurgents through Pakistan and other neighboring countries. US support during this period increased the fighting capacity of the Afghan insurgency and weakened Soviet control in Afghanistan. The rise of the Taliban. After the Soviet-Afghan War, civil war and instability continued in Afghanistan. During this time, there were clashes between different factions, and eventually a religious and political group called the Taliban took control of most of Afghanistan. The Taliban ruled Afghanistan in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and governed the country according to strict Islamist rules. The rise of the Taliban can be seen as one of the consequences of the Soviet-Afghan War and was born out of instability in Afghanistan. The parties involved in the Soviet-Afghan War included the Soviet Union, the Afghan insurgents, and the countries providing international support. These factors played an important role in determining the course and outcome of the war. The Soviet-Afghan War was a major conflict with long-lasting consequences that profoundly affected regional and global political balances. The consequences of this war were profound and complex for both Afghanistan and the international community. Impact on Afghanistan. The Soviet-Afghan War left deep wounds in Afghanistan and plunged the country into instability and conflict. In the aftermath of the war, Afghanistan was plunged into civil war and conflict between many ethnic and religious groups. These conflicts led to the deaths of thousands of people and the displacement of millions. In addition, political instability and weak governance have persisted in the country since the end of the war. International consequences. The Soviet-Afghan War had a profound impact on the international community. It was fought in the context of the Cold War and further fueled East-West rivalry. The United States and its NATO allies opposed the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan by supporting the Afghan insurgents, and this support enabled the Afghan insurgents to fight more effectively against the Soviets. The collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet-Afghan War was a major factor in hastening the end of the Soviet Union. The war strained the Soviet economy and depleted military resources. The Soviet Union's failure in Afghanistan created a great deal of opposition and discontent among the population, sparking protests in various parts of the country. As a result, it helped accelerate the process that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Regional impact. The Soviet-Afghan War also affected the political balance in the Middle East and Central Asia. After the end of the war, instability in Afghanistan spread throughout the region, and its effects were felt in several neighboring countries. In addition, the chaos in post-war Afghanistan contributed to the spread of terrorism and the strengthening of radical groups in the region. Human rights and humanitarian crises. Human rights violations and humanitarian crises during and after the Soviet-Afghan War should not be forgotten. The war caused massive civilian casualties and the displacement of millions of people. Moreover, the war crimes and human rights violations committed during and after the war attracted the attention of the international community and influenced human rights and humanitarian efforts in the post-war period. In conclusion, The Soviet-Afghan War was a conflict with profound and long-lasting consequences for both Afghanistan and the international community. The effects of this war are still being felt today, affecting political, economic, and humanitarian issues in the region.
We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.